Okay, so we start a new topic. So this is on vectors. Now let us define vector first. Vectors are quantities with both magnitude and direction. So far, simula siguro high school, elementary, we've been dealing with quantities that we call scalars. So itong mga scalars na ito, ang meron lang sa kanila ay magnitude. Now, when we begin our discussion in physics, we will repeatedly use quantities na hindi na sila scalar. We will use vectors. And ang difference ng scalars and vectors, ang vectors ay merong direction. So to illustrate that, let me give you one example of a vector. So we have here vector R. Yun yung tawag natin sa vector. And meron siyang two components dito. Ang first is 2 kilometers. So this is actually a displacement ang tawag sa quantity na ito. So itong 2 kilometers, tapos you also have 30 degrees north of east. So since this quantity is a vector, meron siyang magnitude. So that would be your 2 kilometers. Tapos meron din siyang direction. So it would be 30 degrees north of east. Ito yung direction niya. So, yun yung kaibahan ng scalars and vectors. Kung scalar siya, ito lang yung meron, 2 kilometers. We actually call that distance. Pero kung nilagyan mo na ng direction, it will become a vector. Actually, ang tawag natin sa vector na ito is a displacement. And that is one example of a vector quantity. Other examples ng vectors na ma-encounter natin in our discussions is velocity. Tapos we have force, and we have acceleration. Okay, now notice we used itong symbol na ito to indicate yung ating vector R. So for our notation, paano natin i-represent ang vectors na iba-iba per book. May mga book na to indicate a vector, they will use a boldface na letter to indicate the vector. So kung makita kayo na naka-boldface na letter, vector siya. Now others, instead of using boldface letters, they use a simple letter. Tapos lagyan nila ng arrow dito sa taas. So may arrow sa taas to indicate na vector siya. Now some books use both. Naka-boldface tapos may arrow din sa taas. Pero for simplicity sa ating discussion, we will use yung letter lang with arrow. So pag may nakita kayong ganitong symbol, letter, tapos may arrow sa taas, that is a vector. Now, kung gusto naman natin kunin yung magnitude lang, let's say for our vector R, di ba meron siyang magnitude and direction. Kung gusto natin i-indicate yung magnitude lang, what we can do is to simply remove yung arrow, so R lang ang matira. So, ang ibig sabihin nito, magnitude lang. So, R would be 2 kilometers. Ayan, so, yun yung gamitin natin para pare-pareho tayo ng notation. Now, sometimes, ito din yung ginagamit. You have your vector symbol, R, tapos may arrow sa taas, tapos lagyan mo ng absolute value sign. Okay, so this will also mean magnitude. Pag may nakita kayong ganito, that means yung magnitude ni vector R. So that would also be 2 kilometers. Okay, now dahil sa nature ng vectors na meron silang magnitude and direction, it is sometimes useful to represent vectors graphically. And we do that using an arrow. So for instance, yung ating vector kanina, itong vector R, 2 kilometers, 30 degrees north of east. If we draw that, represent yung vector na yan with an arrow, it would look like this. Okay, so ganito yung itsura ng ating vector R. If you check again, 2 kilometers, 30 degrees north of east. Okay, so yan yung itsura ng ating vector R. Now, useful na gamitin yung arrow kasi the length of the arrow will now correspond to the magnitude ng vector mo. Tapos, kung saan nakaturo yung arrow mo, that will now represent your direction. Okay, so useful na gamitin yung arrows to represent our vectors. Now, to illustrate further, let's look at some examples ng vectors. Tapos, let's try to sketch them out in the form of arrows. Ano kayang itsura ng mga vectors na ito? Okay, so let's look at this first vector here. We have vector A. Ang magnitude niya is 11 inches. Tapos ang direction niya is west. 11 inches, tapos west. So how do we represent that with arrow? Now, yung ating directions, north, east, west, south, will look like this. Sa taas ang north, andito ang east, south, tapos andito ang west. So to draw this vector, una nating titignan is the direction. So it should point papuntang west. Now dito sa page natin, that will be to the left. So we will draw an arrow that is pointing to the left. Now it helps to draw an axis. So parang ganito yung itsura ng vector A mo. Now this length will represent yung kanyang magnitude na 11 inch. Okay? So now we were able to represent itong vector na ito with this arrow here. Let's try another example. So let's look at this example here. You have vector B, 19 inch ang kanyang magnitude, 56 degrees east of north yung kanyang direction. So let's sketch this vector here. It's useful to draw an axis. Okay. Tapos maganda, tignan muna natin kung ano yung direction niya. Now, according dito sa nakasulat, ang direction niya is 56 degrees east of north. Now, kung itagalog natin ito siya, ang ibig sabihin nito is nasa east siya ni north. So, ano ibig sabihin nun? Ibig sabihin nun, you start with north, no? Medyo counterintuitive siya, no? Kasi pangalawa siya. Pero you start with north, so ang direction ng north is upwards. Okay? Tapos, you move towards east by 56 degrees. So, yung angle mo will start here, north, papuntang east. Now, east is this direction, no? To the right, no? So, galing kang north, papunta ka ng east by 56 degrees. So, vector B will look like this. Okay? If this is 56 degrees. Okay? So, yun yung ibig sabihin ha, nitong east of north. You start sa north, tapos papunta kang east. Nasa east siya ni north. Okay? North, tapos papuntang east. So, yan yung ating 56 degrees na angle. So, this will be your vector B. Now, let's indicate yung magnitude, 19 inches yung magnitude. So, ganito yung itsura ng vector B natin. Let's look at another example. So, we have vector C. Vector C is 26 inches, 33 degrees south of west. So, let's draw an axis para ma-sketch natin itong vector na ito. Now, yung direction niya says 33 degrees south of west. So, like sa ginawa natin kanina, we will start with west, tapos we will move towards south by 33 degrees. So, ang west natin is to the left. Ito yung west. Tapos, mag-move tayo papuntang south by 33 degrees. Okay, so yung angle natin, galing west, papuntang south. Yung south natin is andito. Andito yung south. Okay? So, ganyan yung itsura nung angle nung ating vector. So, our vector C would look like this. Okay, ganyan yung direction niya. This angle is 33 degrees. Tapos, let's indicate yung ating magnitude, 26 inches. This is now your vector C. Okay? So, galing sa word na description ng ating vectors, we will able to represent yung ating vectors and sketch it using an arrow. Now, this will be useful sa application ng ating mga problems later. No? Maganda na ma-imagine muna natin ano yung itsura ng vectors before we proceed doon sa pag-solve ng problems. Okay, let's look at another example here. So, suppose binigyan tayo ng sketch. Okay, suppose we have these vectors here in form of arrows na siya, no? So, you have vector D, vector E, tapos vector F. Tapos, we are tasked to define yung vectors in word form na naman. Okay? So, let's start with vector D. Paano to siya gawin? Vector D. So, first, we will write yung kanyang magnitude. No, doon sa diagram natin, indicated yung magnitude ng vector D. That is 10 inches. So, lagay natin 10 inch. Tapos, we are to write yung direction. Now, recall lang yung ating directions, north, east, south, and west. And since yung ating vector is pointing downward, ang direction niya would be south. Okay, so medyo madali si vector D. Now, how about vector E? Now, for vector E, ang magnitude niya is 23 inch. So, lagay natin yon. E is equal to 23 inch. Okay, now the direction, very interesting, kasi 45 degrees yung nakalagay dito na direction. Now, yung buong angle na ito, no, yung isang angle between the x-axis and the y-axis, this is 90 degrees. So, ibig sabihin, kung 45 degrees ang nakalagay dito, nandun siya sa exactly na sa gitna. Okay, this is also 45 degrees. So, nasa gitna talaga siya nung buong angle na nandito sa side na ito. Okay? So, in those cases, hindi mo na kailangan maglagay ng angle. Pwedeng sabihin mo na lang, by the way, it is between north and between west. So, we can call that northwest. Kung ganito yung pagkasulat ng direction, it is understood na doon talaga siya sa exact half. So, that would be 45 degrees between north and west. That is also true kung between ano siya, north and east. So, you will call that northeast. Kung between south and west, that will be southwest. Kung between south and east, that will be southeast. So, usually, inuuna nila yung north, mauna yung north, or mauna yung south. So, that's how you represent yung directions that is 45 degrees between two principal directions. Now, for vector F, the magnitude ng ating vector F is 14 inch. So, lagay natin yan, 14 inch. Tapos, you have an angle here that is 60 degrees. Okay? So, isulat natin yan. 60 degrees. Now, let's look at saan nagsimula itong 60 degrees, tapos saan siya papunta. So, nagsimula siya sa south. Diba? Nagsimula siya sa south, tapos papunta siya ng east. No? So, galing sa south, papuntang east. Or, in word form, that will be east of south. Okay? So, nasa east daw ni south. Okay? So, from south to east, that is east of south. Okay? Reverse lang natin. Okay? So, that is 60 degrees east of south. Okay? So, that's how we represent ang ating vectors in terms of words and values. And we can also represent vectors in terms of arrows, where yung direction will be corresponding to where the arrow is pointing, tapos the magnitude will correspond to the length of the arrow.